Hi guys, it's Geekonomics here once again, and you join me for the next in the series with regard to the GCSE stimulus material for June 2018. In the previous video I was considering this whole notion and this statement here about world trade growth slowing. Now interesting, this morning on the news and in the press, the latest data released is that actually now world trade is actually starting to pick up a little bit. So that's the first time actually since the financial crisis that we've started to see a little bit of an uptick in world trade growth. Today I want to focus on this sentence really, World Trade Organization promoting free trade. And so what I'd really like to focus on is this whole notion of trade. Those of you who are obviously using the OCR endorsed textbook, this particular one here by Clive Ritchie's, when you go to reference trade, you will be turning to page 98, which is entitled International Specialization and Trade. And hence, ladies and gentlemen, the title of this particular slide, International Specialization and Trade. So again, I'll try and keep this short, brief, to the point. In your textbook, the definition which is referenced by way of specialization is very similar to something which A-level economists would know as comparative advantage or competitive advantage, being able to produce a good or service at the lowest possible opportunity cost, or as the textbook, the GCSE textbook explains, being able to produce a good or service in the highest quantity at the lowest possible cost. That's what it's referred to as in your GCSE textbook. Now, if you think about this with regard to the UK economy, and you think back over the last few decades, maybe the last 40, 50 years, you can think about the area in which the UK economy specialises nowadays and compare and contrast that with the area of specialisation a few decades ago. So here in the northeast, for example, northeast of England, we would have been specialising in shipbuilding, coal mining, manufacturing, and indeed the UK, predominantly 50, 60 years ago, we would have been talking about the secondary sector, the manufacturing and production sector being the UK's area of comparative advantage. Fast forward to today, of course, and think about those industries. Mining, particularly since the 1980s, obviously in decline. Shipbuilding in decline. These traditional heavy industries which enabled the UK economy to industrialise have now, if they're not already closed, they are certainly shrinking and closing. And so we are deindustrialising. We're moving away from those heavy traditional industries towards our area today of comparative advantage, which of course is the service sector. So you think particularly, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure of London, where we are experts in the area of financial services. We are experts in the area of insurance, really all those types of financial services. Tourism is a big export of the UK economy, and people always think, well, how is that an export? You can't export tourism. Maybe not, but think of what happens when you export a good. The good goes out, the money comes in. Similarly, when tourists come to the UK, they bring money into the UK economy. And so tourism, for that respect, is an export for the UK economy, and a big earner at that as well. And then the other thing which is a really big export would be the entertainment industry. If you think of programs on the television, such as the X Factor, and what's that other one called, The Voice, and so on, which has been developed in the UK and then sold around the globe, so you can see similar programs in the United States, Australia, all around the world. So that's a big export, entertainment and entertainment formats. So the area in which a country specialises does change over time. It's not a static thing, it's a fluid thing which changes over time. Now let's think about why countries would specialise and trade with one another. And these are just very quickly noted the bullet points out of your textbook really. So number one, and we referred to this in the previous slide on the previous video, in order to bring goods in which you can't produce yourself, well, you'll need to buy them in. So you probably need to sell something in order to bring the other good or service in. So it's to bring in things that you can't do yourself. It provides all economies with much greater choice. If we were limited to the choice of only buying goods and services which we produce domestically, then obviously that would greatly restrict our the variety of basket of goods that we could consume, and so it provides choice. Price. Competitive pressures will lower prices and force prices down. So if you are trading on an international market in a similar or indeed identical product, there is an incentive for you to become more efficient, and that then manifests itself for us as consumers in a lower price. That, of course, is to our benefit as consumers. It also prevents, this whole notion of competitive pressures, prevents things such as monopolies arising and firms growing too big for their boots, as it were, and being able to exploit us as consumers and charge us high prices because they're the only manufacturer of certain good or service. Well, if you've got large numbers of providers, then that limits the opportunities for monopolies to arise and gain a foothold. Economies of scale. If firms are trading internationally, the potential for them to grow and expand and benefit from economies of scale, something I've just been looking at with my sixth form today, well, those economies of scale opportunities will be larger. So what are economies of scale? Well, the definition is those aspects of increasing size which lead to falling average costs. Now, as a firm grows and costs of production rise due to these things called economies of scale, such as being able to buy in bulk, for example, then hopefully that cost reduction follows on to a reduction in price level for consumers. And as a consequence of that, consumers enjoy lower prices. So again, coming back to this whole price point idea. It also means that you've got less reliance on domestic markets, and so if there is a bit of a hiccup or a bottleneck in a domestic market, or prices become too expensive in your own domestic market, then you can look for alternative substitutes elsewhere. You are not simply reliant upon your own natural resource and what you can do in your own economy. And then finally, and this takes us into the worked example which I'm about to show you, hopefully, if firms specialise in what they're best at, they can then produce much more of that good or service. And as a consequence of that, world output of that particular good or service will go up. And then you can trade with one another, countries can trade with one another, and so countries, by definition, therefore enjoy consuming more and more goods and services. So I'll just show you this worked example with regard to that very point. So your textbook, GCSE textbook, doesn't go into a term which we refer to as comparative advantage, but it does talk about absolute advantage. An absolute advantage is being able to produce more of a good or service in absolute terms, so in absolute quantity, than your competitor. So consider this example where we've got output per worker of cars and grapes for two countries, Portugal and the United Kingdom. Now we can look at this data and we can see that the UK has the absolute advantage in car production because it can produce 20 cars relative to Portugal's 5. And vice versa. In Portugal, Portugal has what we call the absolute advantage in grapes because it can produce 20 per worker rather than as opposed to the 5 in the UK. Now, on that basis, it would seem logical and beneficial to world trade and world trade growth and world output. It seems logical that Portugal should specialise in only producing grapes. Scrap this, ladies and gentlemen, scrap this whole notion here of, sorry, let me just fix this. Scrap this notion, ladies and gentlemen, of car production in Portugal. Scrap the notion of grape production in the UK, and let the UK be a manufacturer of cars, let the Portuguese be manufacturers of grapes, and let them trade. So if the UK wants some grapes, well, bring them in from Portugal. If Portugal wants some cars, let them bring them in from the UK. So let's have some exports and imports going between countries here. Now, the other thing which I should have said at the beginning of this table is, we're assuming here that Portugal and the UK, 50% of their workforce is dedicated to car production and 50% to grapes. Now we're going to go 100% for the UK into cars and 100% for Portugal into grapes, which will lead to this outcome. So now the UK can produce 40 cars, Portugal can produce 40 grapes, and as a consequence, total output goes from, if you remember, 25 and 25. Total output now goes 40 in both countries. So 25 plus 25 is 50, 40 plus 40 is 80. So world output has gone up by 30. And of course, now there is the opportunity for trade to take place. So now is the opportunity for imports and exports to take place between the nations, thus enabling them to consume more, and hence the world economy benefits from this thing called specialisation and trade. Now, of course, as with all of these things, it's not all rosy. Everything in the garden is not necessarily rosy. And whilst at the moment, as members of the European Union, we can have free movement of goods, services, capital and people across borders and frontiers, there are concerns with regard to international specialisation and trade, mainly in terms of the production aspect. So the concerns would be, some of the concerns would be the following. Number one, pollution. If you think of China, for example, I read in the Financial Times this morning that China, as a result of very, very substantial bans on pollution in the last few months of 2017, they've actually managed to bring their pollution and smog down quite significantly. But of course, a lot of goods are manufactured in China, and these factories are pumping, generally unregulated, and pumping out enormous amounts of pollution. So pollution's a big problem. Global warming's a big problem. Professor Joseph Stiglitz, for those of you who've read his book, or books, Globalization and the World Economy, I think it's called, something along those lines, he talks about this thing called the race to the bottom. In other words, manufacturers, they want to locate in the place or places where regulations are lowest, wages are lowest, there's no regulation with regard to working hours or working conditions or breaks or pollution for that matter. And so you get this thing called the race to the bottom. In other words, the bottom of the pile in terms of regulation, which is all very well in one respect in that it generates jobs in those countries, but it's not very good in terms of the welfare of the workers with regard to the number of hours they're working, the pay they're receiving, the conditions they're working under, the pollutants that they're breathing in. So all these pros and cons to go alongside that. Production chains are another big factor. So production chains you can have various parts of various bits of machines, for example, produced in different countries. So here in the northeast of England, where we have the Nissan factory on our doorstep, some of those components which are going in to produce the car in Sunderland come all the way from Japan. Well, when the earthquake struck in Japan, or tsunami, a couple of years ago, that meant that production in Japan stopped. Now, because production in Japan stopped, that then held up production on our doorstep here in Sunderland. So you need to think about the limitations of having all of these separate components being constantly shipped in from different parts of the world. And then finally, this thing called systemic risk. Now this is mainly to do with the sort of the financial institutions around the world and the way in which financial institutions are so heavily intertwined nowadays, which means that if you get a very significant financial shock in one area of the globe, it inadvertently hits another area which is nothing to do with the actual problem. So the financial crash of 2008, for example, is a great example of that. Financial problem which started in the United States, then spread all the way to the US, spread from the US to the UK, because of this thing called systemic risk. The financial institutions are so intertwined that a problem which developed in the United States spread to the UK. So I'm going to leave it at that, ladies and gentlemen, and that's all I'm going to say on that little section on trade. The next slide and the next video will be on the World Trade Organization, which of course is the start of that paragraph there. So I look forward to bringing you that in the near term, ladies and gentlemen. As ever, do subscribe. If you've got any questions, email me, hello@geekonomics.co.uk, and I'll do my best to get back to you. So that's it for now, ladies and gents. Thank you, and